On what begins as a celebratory day in New Orleans, a tragic event strikes when an explosive goes off aboard a ferry carrying U.S. Navy personnel and their families. While a few jumps into the river to save themselves, the explosion brutally ends the lives of 543 passengers on board. A.T.F. Special Agent Doug Carlin is called to investigate the scene and discovers burnt plastic and connecting wires along the riverbank, leading him to suspect foul play, compelling him to request all surveillance footage from around the area. Continuing his investigation, that takes him beneath the adjacent Crescent City Bridge, where FBI agent Paul later finds him. With Paul's help, Doug concludes that the explosive used was possibly ammonium nitrate, a water-soluble substance. Armed with this evidence, Doug deduced the explosion couldn't have been an accident. He reports his findings to his superiors before returning to his office, where he meets his colleague Donnelly. Together, they begin reviewing the surveillance footage Doug had requested earlier. Doug tries to contact his partner, ATF Special Agent Larry, leaving a message urging him to assist with the case. He then calls back an anonymous lead who had left him a voicemail, but only reaches their answering machine instead. After leaving a message, he spots a mysterious man on the bridge just before the explosion. Meanwhile, the lead investigator, Special Agent Jack McCready, speaks to the press, confirming that the explosion was a deliberate act of terror. Doug receives intriguing information about a body found in the river before the explosion and decides to investigate. The body belongs to a woman named 𝐀.𝐓.𝐅. During the examination, Doug notices duct tape residue across her mouth and that one of her earrings is missing. His colleague, Donnelly, informs him about a missing report in her name. He then visits Claire's father, who reveals that she was supposed to pick him up from the airport that morning, where Doug also learns about Claire's ex-fiancé, Alan, and also requests the keys to Claire's house. As Doug searches her apartment, he then hears his own voice on her answering machine, realizing she was the person who had left him a message at the office earlier. He then meets with Special Agent Jack McCready to report his findings about Claire, and mentions that Claire's body had heavy fuel burns and traces of PTN, a base explosive often used by domestic terrorists. He also adds that her severed fingers were staged to appear as if they were caused by the blast. However, the autopsy reveals that Claire's death occurred about 2 hours before the explosion, suggesting foul play. Doug theorizes that Claire was abducted, tortured, and killed, with her body thrown into the river to make her appear as one of the explosion's victims. He identifies PTN as the link between her murder and the ferry bombing, suspecting that Claire's missing van might have been used in the explosion. He also adds the crucial detail that Claire had called the ATF office earlier that morning. Before taking a leave, he notices his partner Larry's car, and upon inquiring, he's informed that it is among the vehicles belonging to the victims of the blast. Later, Doug speaks with FBI agent Paul, who invites him to join a special investigative unit working on the ferry bombing case. After considering it, he agrees, motivated by his desire to find the culprit behind his partner's death. Accompanies Paul. Doug finds that the team is led by Dr. Alexander. To his surprise, the team utilizes a unique surveillance digital recreation program called Snow White that uses primary data from satellite images, allowing investigators to virtually explore past events in incredible detail. The challenges they're facing with their surveillance technology is that they can only access footage from 4 days and 6 hours prior to the explosion. This process takes time, and they can view the footage only once without the option to rewind and confirm details. Upon asking for his opinion on where to search for clues regarding the ferry bombing, Doug suggests checking Claire's house instead. By observing the surveillance from her apartment, he uncovers critical information. Claire's ex-fiancé, Alan, had contacted her 4.5 days ago, pressuring her to sell her van and share half the proceeds. Doug also learns from her father that Claire indeed had a pickup date on the morning of her disappearance. Despite some unsettling incidents, Doug doubts that Claire can sense that she's being watched and is under surveillance. However, Paul reassures him that any connection is strictly one-way, indicating that Claire cannot communicate with them. However, Alexander avoids providing any such assurance. At Claire's funeral the next day, Doug notices that Alan is absent, which raises his suspicions about the possibility of the bomber attending instead. Later, while reviewing the surveillance footage again, the team witnesses Claire receiving a call about her van sale. Doug's instincts tell him that this caller is likely the bomber they are looking for. He requests that the call be recorded for further voice analysis. Unfortunately, tracking the number leads to a public phone booth outside the operational area of the Snow White program. Nevertheless, armed with the voice from the call, the team turns to general surveillance footage from an ATM across from the phone booth, only to see the caller's back. By using facial recognition software on his bag though, Doug has managed to match it to its owner on the footage of the ferry's dock 2 nights before the explosion. This also leads to a realization that within 7 hours, they will be able to use Snow White to see who the bomber is. Continuing to observe Claire, Doug decides to act on his earlier intuition. He deliberately shines a beam of laser onto the screen. The entire system collapses. Shockingly, Claire notices this disruption in her house. The team is forced to reveal the secrets they had been hiding till now. The team explains that Snow White is an advanced technology capable of folding space back onto itself, allowing them to link two distant points instantaneously. Alexander clarifying that what they are observing right now is the actual past, saying that they stumbled upon this by accident. That is why everyone is scared of messing with it, as they do not know the potential consequences. Realizing out that all of this basically means that they can manipulate time, Doug convinces the team to send an anonymous tip to his past self, detailing the time and location of the suspect. Observing the surveillance footage from his office, Doug realizes that he had an argument with his partner Larry 4.5 days ago. Just before the note can reach him, past Doug leaves the office in frustration, and it is Larry who finds the tip instead. Larry heads to the dock to verify the information, while the team focuses on the surveillance of the dock, hoping to spot the bomber. Eventually spotting him, they successfully identify the suspect, but to Doug's disappointment, they also witness Larry confronting the bomber and getting shot in return. The bomber then begins to flee, moving out of Snow White's range. Determined to save his partner, Doug uses a portable goggle rig which allows him to see through the past while remaining in the present. He swerves through oncoming traffic, guided by the team's directions to follow the bomber's movements. However, a crash in the present disrupts the goggle rig, rendering Doug unable to see the past anymore. But the team can still catch the signal it emits, allowing Doug to continue pursuing the bomber's path. He arrives at a hideout and, after getting out of the vehicle, he then proceeds on foot with the goggle rig and its power source. While Doug can only see remnants of the past in the present, the team observes the past unfolding in real time. Tragically, they witness Larry being shot and then set on fire while the FBI conducts further investigations at the crime scene. Doug discovers a stray earring among the debris, recalling that it was missing from Claire's autopsy. Meanwhile, the bomber is identified as Carol Ohrstad. Once he's tracked down, he's then brought in for questioning with Doug, during which it is revealed that Carol had previously been rejected from joining the military, on the grounds of being unstable. Doug also learns that Carol views himself as a patriot, which is why his rejection from the military compelled him to take violent action against the country's government. Eventually, Doug secures a full confession from Carol regarding the ferry bombing and the methods he used to eliminate both Larry and Claire. He details that while he shot Larry to avoid immediate pain before setting him on fire, he didn't show the same mercy to Claire. He tells that he deliberately shot her to ensure that she wouldn't be associated with the ferry blast victims, as the gunshot would reveal she had been murdered prior to the explosion. With Carol's confession and solid evidence, the in-charge Jack McCready decides to close the investigation. However, Doug struggles to accept this as a victory since they weren't really able to change anything. Paul tries to console Doug by reminding him that they successfully apprehended the culprit and emphasizing that Claire's death is not Doug's fault. Despite Paul's reassurances, Doug contacts Alexander to convince him to send him back in time. Regardless of this would be the first time Snow White is used for such purpose, since the operation had been officially shut down. Doug meets Alexander alone at the team's office, and prepares to go back in time to the morning of the ferry blast. Surprisingly, Alexander successfully sends him back to past, ensuring he appears in a hospital so he can be revived immediately. Waking up later, Doug seizes the opportunity to steal clothes from another patient and sneaks out of the hospital. He takes an ambulance and heads directly to Carol's hideout, where Claire is being held captive. While Carol is preparing to end Claire's life, but she fights back, managing to scratch him and draw blood on his fingers. Realizing this could later be used as evidence against him, Carol grabs pliers to sever her fingers. Surprisingly, Doug arrives, distracting Carol and crashing the ambulance inside his hideout. In response, Carol starts shooting at Doug. He seizes the moment to exit the shed. Crawling out of the wrecked ambulance, he finds Claire unconscious. Carol shoots at the cylinders, blowing up the hideout. Thankfully, Doug manages to grab Claire and pull her to safety before the explosion hits them, and dragging her further away to safety. Doug sees Carol fleeing the scene in Claire's van and notices that he manages to saving Claire just before she lost her fingers. Grabbing another car from the hideout and rushes to Claire's apartment, while warning her about the impending ferry attack. Once they arrive, Doug prepares to treat his wound while also leaving himself a message that will prompt his present self to go back and save Claire's life. He notices the dress Claire changes into and suggests she pick something else to avoid matching the victim profile. Although she pretends to agree, her doubts about Doug's true identity lead her to aim her weapon at him and call the A.T.F. She speaks with Donnelly to confirm Doug's identity and leaves a message for him to call her back, now willing to hear Doug's side of the story. After calming down, she asks him to explain everything that is going on. Doug reveals that he knows certain things ahead of time because of a special government device named Snow White. As Claire finishes tending to his wound, they both begin to understand the gravity of the situation. As Doug looks around the chaotic bathroom, he realizes that nothing has changed since he arrived. He quickly rushes Claire out just as her phone rings. Doug asks her not to answer it and proves his knowledge of the situation by reciting every word of the message her friend left on the answering machine, information he already heard through Snow White. Convinced that Doug can indeed save her, Claire decides to accompany him to the ferry dock, deciding to defuse the bomb himself instead of involving the police, as it may result in Carol changing his plan. Doug gets to the dock with Claire, where she easily spots her van already parked on the ferry's car dock. Once they see Carol on his way out of the dock, Doug instructs her to raise the alarm about the explosive on board as the ferry prepares to leave, before boarding the ferry himself. Meanwhile, Carol is about to leave the dock but recognizes the vehicle Doug took from his hideout. Realizing that his plan is at risk, Carol rushes back toward the ferry, while Doug is forced to leave the car deck quickly. As the ferry is about to depart, Carol manages to board at the last possible moment. Spotting him, Claire decides to jump directly onto the ferry's car deck, disregarding Doug's earlier instructions to stay on the dock. Meanwhile, Doug scans the area and notices that Carol is not on the Crescent City Bridge, as he had seen in the security footage. This realization drives him to rush down to the car deck, where Claire has unfortunately found by Carol. With only about 5 minutes left before the explosion, Doug sees Carol as he opened fire on the car deck, cautiously maneuvers through the parked cars. Doug found Claire bound to the steering wheel of her van. He signals Claire to start the van. Doug begins to repeat phrases he heard during Carol's interrogation in the future, specifically his chilling words about human collateral being the cost of freedom. Doug successfully confuses Carol, giving Claire the opening, and she rams the van into Carol, taking him by surprise. Additionally, Doug shoots Carol, ensuring that he can no longer pose a threat. Just as the police arrive at the ferry's location, they are out of time to free Claire, as they are surrounded by police and only 2 minutes away from the explosion. Doug urgently instructs Claire to drive the van into the river. He manages to free her just before the water fully submerges the vehicle, allowing Claire to swim to the surface. Unable to escape the van in time, Doug is taken out in the underwater explosion. Claire grieves the loss of Doug even as she is rescued and taken back to the dock. Amidst several relieved family reunions, she is surprised to see the present-day Doug arriving on the scene. This time, however, the roles are reversed. Claire possesses all the knowledge of the events that transpired, while Doug is left with only a faint sense of déjà vu. Thanks for watching. If you have enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. See you in the next one.